I'm Ruth Werner, and as I was preparing my article on SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, I had to learn a lot about our intestinal microbiome. That information ended up being a little peripheral to the main topic, but it was so cool. So I'm really excited to be able to share it with you here. You can consider this an audiovisual sidebar. The term microbiome refers to the world of tiny organisms that live in and on us. Most of these microorganisms, which can include bacteria and fungi and viruses, are benign or even helpful when we find them in the appropriate location and in the right numbers. But when they're outside of their normal environment or if they're in extraordinarily high numbers, they sometimes change their characteristics and we can end up with a problem. I wrote about microorganisms that live on our skin in an article called Hand Health, Gloves, Hygiene, and Microbiota in the May-June 2016 edition of the Massage and Bodywork. And in that article, I wrote about this really cool research project called the Belly Button Biodiversity Project, which was then followed up by another thing called Armpit Palooza. So if that sort of thing interests you, then, be sure to check that out. This video is also about the microbiome and its bacterial members, but here we're going to be looking at what's happening inside the digestive tract, not what's on the surface of the skin. So our gut bacteria set up shop right as we're being born, but this environment stays fairly changeable until we adopt a solid food diet. And at that point, things kind of settle down and the microbiome becomes what it is, and it becomes more difficult to change over the long term unless there's some kind of major disruption. Different parts of the gastrointestinal tract, from the esophagus all the way to the anus, are populated with bacteria, even the stomach. And most of these inhabit the distal end of the small intestine, that's the ileum, and also, of course, the colon. The proximal end of the small intestine, that's the duodenum and the jejunum of healthy people, is only sparsely populated with bacteria. When scientists try to count large numbers, they will express them as exponents of 10 to describe, for instance, bacterial counts. So a sample of fluid from the duodenum of a healthy person typically shows about 10 to the third bacteria per milliliter. To translate that into terms that I can understand, 10 to the third means about 1,000 bacteria per milliliter, which is about a fifth of a teaspoon. By contrast, the fluid inside the colon holds about 10 to the 12th bacteria per cubic milliliter. 10 to the 12th, that's a trillion. SIBO is identified when the bacterial count in the proximal small intestine is anything over 10 to the 5th bacteria per cubic milliliter. That's 100,000 bacteria per 1/5 of a teaspoon. But numbers are not the only difference between the bacterial populations that we have in our proximal small intestine versus our distal small intestine. Bacteria in the upper GI tract are mostly aerobic, and in the lower GI tract, they're mostly anaerobic, and that's exactly as it should be. But if anaerobic bacteria find their way into the jejunum and the duodenum, they can cause problems. No matter where they are, gut bacteria in healthy people help us with vital functions, and it would be really hard to live without them. We provide them with a friendly environment. They help us metabolize food to derive nutritional value. They strengthen our immune system responses. They help us metabolize drugs. They regulate our cardiovascular and nervous systems in ways that we're just beginning to understand. They may even protect us from certain kinds of cancer. When we have a healthy microbiome, we have an appropriate distribution of a diverse population of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. And with these bacteria, we have a highly functional symbiotic relationship. So, how do we keep that microbiome healthy? Well, we have several mechanisms to help prevent the overgrowth of bacteria in the upper GI tract, including gastric acid from the stomach that destroys many microorganisms. Protein-destroying enzymes destroy bacteria. The ileocecal valve prevents backsplash from the colon into the small intestine, and peristalsis helps move all of the intestinal contents in the correct direction, and it's meant to help prevent backflow. We also have an active and aggressive immune system response to bacteria in the upper GI tract, and all of these mechanisms work together to keep the gut microbiome in balance and in the correct location. Another big factor in microbiome health is diversity. We want a broad array of bacterial species. We see this is associated with good gut health and with resilience. That's the ability to restore equilibrium to the microbiome after it has been challenged. We see that when the gut microbiome lacks diversity, the risk for several problems goes up, including things like C. diff, that's Clostridium difficile, infections, a higher risk of obesity, insulin resistance that can lead to diabetes, high blood cholesterol, even an increased systemic level of inflammatory markers. The exact sequence from non-diverse species to the development of some of these conditions is not clear, but it's the subject of some really exciting study as we're trying to get a handle on how to promote good gut health, which then leads to overall good constitutional health. So what is it then that challenges the health of the microbiome? The primary factors are just a few things, including diet. We've talked about how newborns continue to develop their microbiome until they develop a consistent diet. But we also see some differences in people whose diets emphasize certain kinds of food. Age is a factor. So is genetics. That seems to have a big influence on whether we're good hosts to certain kinds of microorganisms. The vitality of the host's immune system is another thing, especially for people who are immune compromised in any way. And of course, a history of antibiotic exposure is a big issue as well, both through medical use to treat bacterial infections, but also through environmental exposures to antibiotics. Overall, the resilience of our microbiome should be really strong, but if it's disturbed, it can be really difficult to restore it to normal levels. What happens when it's out of whack? How do we restore it? Well, that brings us back to the pathophysiology of SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and back to that article in Massage and Bodywork. I will add at this point that some people may be really eager for me to share the big solution to all of our microbiome challenges. Is it to use probiotics? Is it to do some kind of intestinal cleanse? Is it to adopt a specific diet? What's the secret? To this I answer, there's no single solution. There are a few things that we're pretty sure don't work. And as I always say in my live classes, if you are asking me for nutritional advice, you are really barking up the wrong tree. So for now, I'm just going to enjoy my kombucha, and I will see you